Hello and welcome to this video where we'll be looking at the market structure of pure monopoly for an economics 101 course. So if you would like to look for more content or more resources regarding economic statistics and all that, you can check out my website where you can find a lot of resources there. And you can also check out the YouTube for other videos on other topics and other subjects. So what we'll do with this chapter, we are going to break it down into different pieces. And the first one is we're going to recap because you probably have had a chance to speak about the different characteristics of different market structures. So we'll recap on the characteristics of the pure monopoly. And then after that, we go on to start discussing the details of the pure monopoly. So we speak about um, monopolies and price discrimination, monopoly demand, how monopoly sets its maximizing output and price, and the economic effects of a monopoly, and is also talking about regulated monopolies. So to start off with this video, we're going to talk about the characteristics of a pure monopoly. So as I mentioned before, to kick this off, it's important to reflect on the different market structures, starting off with pure competition, where there was perfect competition, and then as we move towards the right, we have monopolistic competition, oligopoly, and monopoly, and the more we go to the right, we have more and more imperfect competition until we get to monopoly, where it's fully imperfect, right? So that's those the four different market models. So now specifically regarding pure monopoly, we have to remember that there's one firm that will supply the entire market. So there's only one firm that will supply the entire market, and because there's one firm supplying the entire market, that would mean that the firm and the industry are exactly the same thing. So the firm and the industry are synonymous, and this becomes very important when we get to monopoly demand as well. You find that there will also be a unique product, so there's no substitute for this product. And when consumers need this product and want to buy this product, they have to buy it from the monopolist. And because they don't have any competition in this market, there'll be no the non-price competition is really limited to things like um, you know public relations in the cases of public utilities. Maybe they'll use there's not much of advertising that's needed, but maybe they might want to um, advertise for the sake of keeping brand loyalty and maybe informing about the product that they're selling. And it's very limited because they really don't have any rivals in the market. They're not competing against anyone, so you find that the non-price competition will be very, very limited. And the monopolist is a price maker, and we'll discuss this more in detail and talk about monopoly demand and how they choose their maximizing profit. Because when people hear price maker, and they contrast it to what we heard probably in the last chapter, which was perfect competition, you hear that the firm is a price taker, and now you hear price maker. So you sort of think that, oh, so the monopoly chooses the price, and I don't like to think of it that way. I like to look at it as a price maker, and that's exactly what it said, price maker. So you find that they choose an output, and the output they choose to produce is what then makes the price. So it's not like they choose that we want to sell at this price. No, they make the price by choosing the output they want to produce, the output that would make them, or that would lead to them having the highest profit, is what they choose, and then by choosing that output, the price is then chosen, and we'll walk through that when we go to monopoly demand. And there's very many barriers to entry when it comes to pure monopoly, and it's almost completely blocked, right? So these can be legal barriers to entry, technological, it can be financial barriers to entry, which is probably the most common. And you find that things like economies of scale will create a natural monopoly. And this is when you find that only one producer in the market is able to sell at that really, really low price because of economies of scale, and everyone else can't in that leads to us having a natural monopoly. That's also another thing that leads to barriers to entry. So the types of monopolies you can think about um, are regulated monopolies, right? So these come from legal barriers, right? So it comes from not legal barriers, but maybe you can say the government sets it. It says, look, we want this firm to produce a certain good. So you can think of Eskom, for example, which is the electricity provider in South Africa. Legally, I think back in 19, I forget the year, but um, the government set it out and said by regulation, by law, Eskom should be the only company, only firm producing electricity to supply to the country. And obviously, these things have been changing as time goes on. But that's an example of a regulated monopoly, where they can be sanctioned by the government, and then there's a regulator that's there to oversee that. So they are put in legally, and then they're regulated to make sure that the prices don't go too high and the quantities don't become too low and so forth. And then a natural monopoly is when a single supplier is able to meet the whole market demand at a really low average cost. So because of that, they end up holding the whole market because no one else can produce at that really low price. And that's a natural monopoly. A near monopoly is where a firm holds a big market share, right? So a really significant market share, so that it seems like they actually are the only producer, in as much as they'll be competing against a few other producers. They hold such a large market share that it seems like they are the only producer in that market. You can also think of an artificial monopoly, which you can think of the example of De Beers, which we'll speak about just now. Um, that can also be considered an artificial monopoly. And then Eskom is an example of monopoly, right? And this is a regulated monopoly, state owned, and it operates and owns the national grid, and it produces, and up to now it was the only up to recently it was the only official producer of electricity. And then obviously with changes, there's now independent power producers. So there's also NERSA, which regulates the price, basically regulating the quantity, um, um, that ends up to them regulating the price in essence. And then examples, another example, we can look at De Beers. That's a near monopoly, uh, because and also we also look them at artificial as well. They can be considered artificial, um, because for in history you find that there have been a big holder of diamonds, and because they are able to hold the diamonds, they stockpile them, and that leads to them being able to control the price in some sense. And the barriers to entry are very difficult because it's very they've got good contracts with the people that supply the diamonds to them, and because of these contracts there's exclusive mining rights and control over the distribution channels, which basically ends up creating a monopoly, right? So that's why we like to call it artificial, because they're using the fact that they hold back their quantities, as well as these exclusive contracts, in order to actually stop other firms from being big in the market as or competing against them in a significant way. So these are the examples of monopolies that you can think about. Okay. So in the next video in this series, we'll talk about monopoly demand, and we'll also see maybe how it contrasts from purely competitive, or perfectly competitive demand. So that's it for this video. Check out the next one for monopoly demand. Thanks.